vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question. That's two questions, actually.
That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
A very good afternoon to you. It's coming up to 2 o'clock. Today is the 5-year anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire, the deadliest domestic blaze since the Second World War. 72 people lost their lives. Today, many events are taking place to mark the anniversary. We're going to go live to Westfield Shopping Centre. They are marking, it's one of several events happening today to mark that 5-year anniversary. They're going to have 72 seconds of silence, 1 second for each of the victims, and then they're going to read all of their names out. That will start very shortly. It's part of one of many events that have taken place today to mark the anniversary. There was a service earlier today at Westminster Abbey. Residents, survivors of bereaved families, they all attended. The London Mayor was there, other political leaders, including Theresa May. It's one of many events happening. Later on today, there's going to be members of the local community taking part in a silent walk starting at the base of the tower block, and firefighters are going to join. Let's join now in that moment of silence. "72 seconds of silence at Westfield Shopping Centre. The names of each of the victims are going to be read out today, 5 years on from that deadly blaze. Later on, there's going to be a multi-faith service. There's also going to be a walk at 6:30 later on this evening. Survivors will join bereaved families, community groups. They're going to do a silent walk around the tower. Firefighters from across the country will join with them and stand with them too. 5 years on from the deadliest blaze, domestic blaze, since the Second World War. Our reporter, Alice Porter, has been spending time with bereaved families. We'll be hearing from her shortly. This is GB News, and as and when more news happens today, I'll bring it to you here. Right now, it's just 3 minutes past 2, and let's head over to Alex for the afternoon agenda.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About on GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where we get stuck into the issues that we should be looking at in depth. Keeping me company today is author and political commentator Joanne Nadler, who's a former advisor to the Conservative Party. Here's what we're discussing on the show. 5 years since 72 people lost their lives. I'm asking if we've learned any lessons from the Grenfell Tower fire. Another legal challenge to Rwanda deportation. Will the government's migrant programme ever take off? And 40 years after the Falklands War ended, a special service is taking place at the National Memorial in Staffordshire. That's what we're talking about for the next hour. What do you need to talk about? Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet me at gbnews. As people gather by the shrouded Grenfell Tower, still dominating the West London skyline, they think back to that horrific night 5 years ago. At 1 o'clock in the morning on the 14th of June, a 24-storey block home to around 600 people starts to smoulder. Smoke churns around a kitchen after a fridge catches fire. A 999 call goes out. Families slept, oblivious to what was about to happen. 6 minutes later, the first firefighters arrived. Smoke began to climb, waking sleeping residents with more calls made by people told to stay in their flats. Soon, flames leapt from the window, igniting the outside, ripping up the tower's sides at a terrifying rate. Faulty fire doors saw fire tear through corridors. Hundreds of emergency calls, voices drowned out. An hour after the first response, a major incident was declared as 250 firefighters tried to tackle the blaze. Yet it was 40 minutes after that that the stay inside order was dropped. Far too late. 72 people killed, many of them children. 5 years on, nobody has been charged, while 500,000 people still live with the deadly cladding behind one of the greatest human tragedies outside of war. The events of that day shocked the nation, and GB News reporter Alice Porter reflects on what happened at Grenfell.
Fire brigade.
Yeah, hello, hi, in the fire, flat 16 Grenfell Tower.
Sorry, a fire where?
Flat 16 Grenfell Tower.
It was one of the UK's worst modern disasters, as mothers, fathers, children and family members all perished in unimaginable circumstances. Survivors were left homeless, having lost almost all their belongings. Grief soon turned to anger. Theresa May immediately ordered a public inquiry as grieving relatives like Hamdan al-Alami demanded answers.
My family here. Why? Day and night I no sleep. Always crying. I have 4 family die.
Soon after the fire, it quickly emerged that the flammable cladding on the block was central to the rapid spread of the fire. And it turned out that this cladding and other fire safety defects were found in tens of thousands of buildings across the country. Many became completely worthless, and leaseholders had to foot the bill to make them safe. Hayley Tillotson is one of them.
I actually went bankrupt at the end of 2020 because me and my neighbours in my flat in Leeds were paying for hundreds of pounds in waking watch, in new fire alarms and insuring and building insurance, and just loads of costs that we should never have had to pay because it just isn't our fault.
After mounting pressure, Housing Secretary Michael Gove announced in January that building developers would be the ones to remove dangerous cladding.
I'm clear about who should pay the price for remedying failures. It should be the industries who profited as they cause the problem and those who continue to profit as they make it worse. To those who missold dangerous products like cladding or insulation, to those who cut corners to save cash as they developed or refurbished people's homes, and to those who sought to profiteer from the consequences of the Grenfell tragedy, we are coming for you.
But since then, many argue that little has changed and that progress has been too slow. 2 weeks ago, the government banned the specific type of cladding which allowed the blaze to spread so rapidly, half a decade since the fire took place. But while debate over housing regulations continue and the much-delayed public inquiry into Grenfell rumbles on, a community continues to grieve. During the Jubilee weekend, a poignant street party was held close to the tower, with 72 empty chairs to commemorate those who died. Emma O'Connor is one of the survivors of the fire.
It should really be speaking volumes to the government that we care, and your actions speak louder than words, and we don't see any government help. We just we're not even allowed the tower back under our control.
Grenfell Tower still looms over London's landscape like a gravestone, a constant reminder of all those who lost their lives. Alice Porter, GB News.
We can cross live to Alice Porter now in West London near the Grenfell site. Alice.
Hi there. Yes, I've been speaking with residents today, and I have to say it is a very mixed picture from so many people. On the one hand, many of them have spoken about people coming together in solidarity, but there's also many people who are still angry that 5 years on, not enough has been changed to make buildings safe across the UK. Now, I want to bring in Lucy Massoud. He's a former firefighter who was a Fire Brigade Trade Union senior representative, and you were there the day after Grenfell happened. I mean, just firstly, just talk to me about the difficulties for the firefighters who are having to deal with such a difficult situation.
Well, it was absolutely heartbreaking for them. As firefighters, we're trained. We deal with grisly scenes all the time. We deal with fatalities all the time. But what we saw on that night 5 years ago was like something we've never seen before, and inshallah we'll never see again. My colleagues and friends who attended on that night were literally having to make the choice between who they could save and who they had to leave behind. They're absolutely devastated. Some of them still suffer today. And we also need to remember the control workers. Now, those control workers were people who took the phone calls from the people inside Grenfell Tower, and on some occasions literally listened to them die on the end of the phone. You don't recover from that. But of course, however horrendous and awful it was for the firefighters and the control workers, imagine how bad it is for this community. We're 5 years on and we still don't really know what happened and why it happened.
Yes, that was the next question I really wanted to ask you. I mean, we're sort of 5 years on, there's a lot of discussion about cladding, and we've got the inquiry, it's ongoing, which I know you've been dealing with as well. I mean, 5 years on, has enough changed?
Absolutely not. As you say, we're 5 years on from the biggest loss of life in post-war history. 73 men, women and children burned to death in their beds. 5 years on, and we still have 53 buildings in this country covered in exactly the same type of cladding that was wrapped around Grenfell Tower. What will it take for this government and property developers to wake up and do the right thing? You have hundreds of residents in this country still living in a death trap, and it's not right. Something needs to be done.
Now, there may be a number of people watching this who, yes, there's a lot, of course, issues with buildings and cladding, and many people angry at developers. But the London Fire Brigade also got significant criticism for the stay-put policy. I mean, people were staying in a burning building for an hour and a half. And I think a lot of people were surprised to know that that was policy. Can you just explain why that policy was in effect, and is it still warranted to be used in the way it is?
Well, it's not my job to defend the stay-put policy. I don't work for the London Fire Brigade. But what I would say is the stay-put policy is the absolutely right policy when the building is working. Now, what those firefighters would have assumed, and whoever was in charge of the attendance, whether it was Danny Cotton, who arrived there later, or Andy Rowe, or Mike Dowden, who was first on the scene, you would assume that that building that is situated in the richest borough in Europe would be working properly. Now, it wasn't working properly. It was covered in illegal flammable cladding. Now, had it not been, the stay-put policy would absolutely have been the appropriate policy put in place. Like I said, I'm not going to stand here and defend every single action on the night. Mistakes were made, for sure. But what we should be asking is, why were the firefighters put in that situation in the first place? And we need to remember as well that leading up to the fire cover in Kensington Borough alone had been reduced by 50%. So that's 50% less firefighters, fire engines and fire stations. And those cuts had been made by the then Mayor, now Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. So those are the questions we should be asking. Were the firefighters given the right tools on the night? We say no. We also say that we were having to deal with a building that shouldn't have been in there in the first place because it was covered in illegal flammable cladding. The stay-put policy would have worked had the building been working properly.
Now, of course, Michael Gove is very much was sort of saying in January, we're going to come after you in terms of the developers and wanting them to pay to have the cladding removed. I mean, we've got, of course, also got in the last couple of months a new Building Safety Act that's come into fruition. I mean, this is also a very difficult issue. There's, some of it's issues with the local authority, some of it's to do with planning. I mean, it is a difficult issue for the government to handle in many ways as well.
Absolutely, and to give Michael Gove his due, he does seem to be doing a little bit more than his predecessor, which, wasn't a high bar to reach. But as you say, at the beginning of the year, he did come out with new policies and said that property developers would have to act. Yet, when he was asked on the radio last week how many buildings in this country still had cladding on them, he didn't know. But I know, and it's 53. So whatever he's saying clearly isn't having an impact on those property developers. What we need is for this government to clamp down on these property developers and make them remove that cladding immediately. There's absolutely no excuse for it, that we can be living in this country, one of the richest countries in the world, and we still have people living in death traps. What more is it going to take for this government to sit up? Do we need another Grenfell?
Well, look, thank you so much for speaking to me today. I really appreciate it. And I think we've got a number of important issues there, particularly when it comes to making sure that buildings are safe in the country. And many people feel 5 years on, that simply hasn't happened.
Alice, thank you. Well, we're joined now by investigative journalist Tom Bergin, who has extensively covered the UK cladding scandal, which emerged in the wake of the Grenfell Tower fire, and Joanne Nadler, the political commentator, who is my studio guest for the day. Tom, I mean, I want you to begin by explaining to the audience some of the cover-ups, where the blame is portioned and some of the cover-ups that have taken... I mean, we'd need hours to do it, frankly, but what are the biggest failings and the biggest cover-ups?
Well, I think the principal reason why, and it was alluded to by the previous speaker there from representing the firefighters, the biggest reason we had this extreme loss of life came down to one issue, and that was the cladding material that was put on the outside. It shouldn't have been there. Theresa May and the Prime Minister at the time and several other ministers were very clear this was illegal. All the lawyers I've spoken to have looked at the issue, say that post-2006, when a specific fire test was introduced, this kind of material was no longer compliant with the regulations. Nonetheless, people put it on. It was put on to Grenfell. And basically what you were doing, just to understand, this is material that you've got aluminium, and inside it it's plastic, which of course comes from oil. So effectively what you've done is you've wrapped a tall building in oil. Now, obviously what's going to happen is it's going to go up in flames as soon as it gets heated. Everyone knew this. The manufacturer of the panel material was very clear. They said not only should you not use this on tall buildings, the material that was one step better than this you shouldn't use on a building the height of Grenfell. They basically used a material that was sort of 2 steps inadequate on the building, and that was the main reason that the building caught fire so quickly. It's why the idea is the stay put policy didn't make sense anymore, because the inherent fire characteristics of the building changed the minute you put this material on it. And it is amazing that it ever came to this, because it wasn't something... I've covered a lot of disasters, industrial disasters and other things. This one is not that complicated in that sense. We know why it happened. It's also not that complicated if you decide to refit a building to figure out what kind of material you'd want to use. It shouldn't take you more than an hour on the internet. it seems that nobody involved in this decided to spend that hour, and of course the money that it would have taken to buy it.
How did that material end up on that building? Was it one person's decision? Was it a whole host of people who didn't know, who didn't read the rules?
Well, it's a good question. I think because we've had the hearings and everyone, of course, claimed not to be responsible, that it was someone else's responsibility to check the rules. Now, that's a problem. At the end of the day, in most situations, you would expect that everyone who's responsible for signing these things off must be responsible. You know, it's interesting. We have in this country a situation where corporate manslaughter has sort of arisen as a crime over the past sort of 20 years. The legislation has sort of solidified somewhat. It's seen a couple of tradespeople go to prison. So if your electrician uses a cheap material where he shouldn't or she shouldn't, they may go to jail, and we've seen people go to jail. Now we have a situation where, you know, dozens and dozens of people have been killed, and everyone's shrugging their shoulders and saying it wasn't my job to do it. You know, the rules, there has been some criticism about the regulations. I'm not sure that's all fair, because at the end of the day, as I said, you know, most people that I spoke to at the time were clear this material shouldn't have been there. So it's really about, you know, what does the law hold people to account when they ignore those regulations?
I mean, it's shocking. When you read the details of what happened that night, it's harrowing. It's utterly harrowing. And when you think that there are still buildings in this country with that cladding, Joanne, and Michael go there saying, well, the developers should be paying to take it off. Why has this not been done? Why are there people living with that on the outside of their buildings?
Well, I think Michael Gove is talking specifically about buildings that are wholly in the private sector. So I presume there must be some legal restraints around how much the government can get involved with that. I don't know. But I think it's interesting listening to the conversation since the start of the programme. You know, what happened has been described as a tragedy. It's been described as a disaster. It's actually a scandal. And you're talking about the details on the night being horrendous to consider. But what the inquiry has brought out and what sort of the research that people like Tom have been doing has shown is the kind of institutional failures throughout the whole process of allowing this cladding to be applied to a building like this. And so my concern, in a way, is that when all the legal processes have been gone through, when the inquiry is finished, people who have suffered in this awful way still won't face any real justice because, as Tom has said, it seems actually potentially quite unlikely that anyone will face a prison sentence. So there may be some fines, and one has to ask if that's really proportionate to what's happened here and the degree of culpability which seems to be shared across the private sector, across the regulations, across the state. I mean, there have been failures at all levels to have reached to this conclusion.
Yeah, and it's so important, Tom, that you continue your amazing work with investigating this as well. Tom Berg and Joanne Nadler, thank you ever so much. Well, let me know your views on this. You horrified that 5 years later people are still living with this cladding. How did learning about that dreadful night affect you? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or tweet us at gbnews. You're with GB News on TV and radio. Coming up, will the government's Rwanda migrant plan ever take off? 4 migrants due to be on board the flights today have launched a legal challenge. We'll have the latest from the High Court. Time for a short break now and a check on the weather forecast.
Hello, I'm Alex Deakin. Plenty of sunny weather to come over the next few days, actually. It's a bit warmer today and the temperatures will continue to tick up through the rest of this week. Hot for most of us by Friday. All thanks to an area of high pressure, which is dominating, but it isn't completely in control. Around it, weather fronts continue to topple in towards western parts of Scotland. So it's not going to be too sunny here. The Highlands, the Western Isles and Shetland seeing cloud and outbreaks of rain through the rest of today. Small chance of a shower over the Grampians further east across Scotland as well. But for most places, it's dry. Plenty of sunshine across the south. Always a bit more cloud at times over northern England, southern Scotland and Northern Ireland. Small chance of a shower here as well. Temperatures in the mid to high teens where it stays cloudy, but in the sunshine, warmer than yesterday. Low to mid 20s across the southeast. and through this evening and overnight, we'll continue to see some patchy rain. It may ease off for a time over the Highlands, but then more rain will topple back in through the night. Elsewhere, we see generally clear skies. Temperatures will dip down to maybe 8 or 9 in rural spots. Most towns and cities staying in double figures, and the nights are going to get warmer through the rest of this week, as are the days, with more sunshine to come. Tomorrow it will be a little bit hotter and plenty of sunshine on offer for England, Wales, much of southern and eastern Scotland, most of Northern Ireland too. Again, it'll be the Highlands, the Western Isles and Northern Isles that see the thickest cloud and a bit of showery rain at times. But I say, for most, it's all about the strong sunshine, with temperatures across northern Britain, high teens, low 20s. Further south, mid to even high 20s across the southeast. The coasts will be cooler, and it'll be cooler with the patchy rain in the northwest. But ticking up day on day, so by Thursday and into Friday in particular, we are likely to see temperatures high 20s, low, even across the southeast on Friday, maybe even the mid-30s. The sun is very strong at the moment, so make sure you put the sunscreen on. Increasing chance of a shower by the weekend.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
we're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
The national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, but I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Crying out loud. The plane that was supposed to take off for Rwanda with over 120 migrants was already down to just 7 passengers this morning. Now, 4 of the remaining would-be deportees on the 50-metre-long jumbo jet are locked in predictable last-minute tussles. It will take off, insisted the Home Secretary in a comedy performance that would be too farcical even for the thick of it. It's pesky lefty lawyers, harumphed the Boris backers, playing to the crowd. But are the millions of pounds of legal fees paid for by you worth it, amidst the predictable din of opposition and abject failure of the whole absurd thing? Well, Downing Street have essentially been forced to concede Boris Air probably won't take off today. Maybe it will, while over 150 more migrants arrived on our shores yesterday alone. The bluster around the doomed-to-fail scheme was always designed to be just that. Taxpayer-funded theatrics built by a government without a plan. Well, let's cross live to the High Court and GB News reporter Ellie Costello. Ellie, I can't keep up with this. I've been trying to follow all day what's going on. Is it going to take off?
Yes, Alex, there's a lot going on today, and there have been two questions kind of rising above it all, which is this plane going to take off? And if it is, will there be anybody on it? And it does look as though, as the day draws on, that plane will be taking off, and there will be at least one migrant on it. And that's what the government has been saying this whole time, that as long as one migrant is on that plane, that is all that matters. This is a matter of principle. So let's start with the UK Supreme Court. That is the highest court in the land. They have refused to block that first deportation flight to Rwanda tonight. They actually refused to hear the argument, meaning that they support the Court of Appeal's decision to allow that flight to go ahead, which means that all tiers of the English legal system, the UK's legal system, have given the green light for this flight to take off. And here behind me at the High Court, there have been 4 individual applications that have been made. These are from 4 migrants that are supposed to be on this flight tonight. The first was heard this morning and it was dismissed, meaning that we know that at least one person will be on that flight to Kigali tonight. The other 3 applications started at 2 p.m. inside the High Court behind me. We will find out a little bit later on whether they were successful in their bids or indeed they will be deported to Rwanda tonight. There is a sighting of a plane at Boscombe Down in Wiltshire near Amesbury at the moment. There are reports that that is the flight that will be taking these migrants to Rwanda this evening, and understanding that is already on the runway.
Ellie, thank you ever so much. Great reporting there. Let's talk to studio guest throughout the show today, author and political commentator Joanne Nadler. Joanne, I get the optics of this. I get the fact that the government need to show that this can happen. But one person on a jumbo jet, potentially millions of pounds in legal fees, and that's if the plane can take off, if, activists haven't glued themselves to it in some way. I mean, this is all about optics, isn't it? It's not a credible plan.
I think it is partly about optics, and I share some of your scepticism about the plan. But I think that the government is also well within its rights to try and enforce the country's borders. After all, in a sense, that's absolutely fundamentally what any government of a sovereign country should be doing. Now, whether or not, once you've got rid of all the heat around this issue, this particular proposal can really effectively do that, I think it's quite difficult to investigate that, because it's been launched in this way that seems to have been designed deliberately to be provocative and to kind of smoke out the opposition, as it were. And to that extent, I suppose you could say that it's been reasonably successful. I mean, it's brought the Church of England out in a great big huff. It's obviously brought what people call lawfare to the fore, i.e. millions of pounds that are being spent to defend the cases of individual migrants. So, I mean, it's a hugely sort of complex area with a great deal of disinformation around it. So it's quite difficult to get in and ask how effective this policy will be. But I think the government will see even one person on this plane, and the fact that the Supreme Court has effectively allowed this to go ahead, and that as being something of a victory for this policy.
But the thing is, I mean, I agree with everything you've just said there, but it seems to me this is always all too predictable. I said as soon as I heard the plan, it's going to be a legal nightmare. Like you said, it's going to smoke out all of the opposition. Is there not a risk now that there's a dangerous precedent set that 120-odd people are supposed to be on it? If one person is, 119 are not. So how are they going to up the numbers for future flights?
Well, I think the fact is that if the flight didn't go ahead at all, that would be even a worse precedent, if that's your criteria for making a judgment on whether this policy is going to work or not. And I mean, it's just too soon to say, isn't it? Because will the flight going off create a significant and enough of a symbol to try to work down the system, as Priti Patel wants, to give a message to illegal people smugglers? And it's hard to see that one person on a plane will make that difference. But I'm prepared to give the government the benefit of the doubt on this, because there don't seem to be any other or better suggestions as to how to break this logjam.
Joanne, thank you ever so much. I want to know your views on this one. Are you happy that your taxpayers' money has been spent on lots of lawyers, essentially filling their pockets to stop people getting on that plane? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or tweet us at GBNews. You're with GB News on TV and DAB Radio. Coming up, 40 years since the end of the Falklands War, a memorial service is being held to remember the sacrifices made by British troops. Now it's time for the news headlines.
Good afternoon, it's 2:32. I'm Rosie Wright, keeping you up to date on GB News. The Supreme Court has ruled the first flight carrying asylum seekers to Rwanda can go ahead as planned this evening. It's after senior judges dismissed campaigners' attempts to get an injunction to stop it and denied permission to appeal the decision. The Supreme Court has also refused to hear an appeal by an asylum seeker who's due on board tonight's flight. The court's president has said if the government's policy is found to be unlawful, migrants will be brought back to the UK. Scotland's First Minister says there's an indisputable mandate for a second referendum on Scotland's independence from the United Kingdom. Speaking in Edinburgh, Scot Nicola Sturgeon said it would allow for a wealthier, fairer and more resilient nation. She says people in Scotland are suffering from many implications of a Brexit they did not vote for. Scotland previously held a referendum in 2014 on the issue, where 55% of the country voted against independence. The Foreign Secretary says the EU has absolutely no reason to retaliate against government plans to override the Northern Ireland Protocol. The EU has threatened legal action if the changes go ahead. Ireland's Foreign Affairs Minister, Simon Coveney, warned it could destabilise peace in Northern Ireland. The government claims the new rules will make it easier for goods to travel there from Great Britain. Ahead of 3 days of national rail strikes next week, Downing Street is accusing rail unions of moving forward with industrial action without proper negotiations. As thousands more railway workers are due to be balloted for strikes and disputes over pay and conditions, the government says it's doing everything possible to encourage unions to step back. The names of all of the 72 victims of the Grenfell Tower disaster have been read out at a memorial service marking the 5th anniversary of the fire. Residents, survivors and bereaved families had gathered at Westminster Abbey alongside the London Mayor and political leaders as part of a series of events being held today. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now I go back to Alex shortly for We Need to Talk About.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV,
on radio, on digital.
Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices.
With honest and civilised conversation.
We're not part of the establishment.
We're one of you. And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, the comedy panel show that's just like the news, in that the left fights the right and it doesn't really seem to matter who wins. We cover the big stories. It was in fact a troop of baboons and not angry vegans.
I like that.
And the really important stories.
Fat naked cow gets stuck in swimming pool.
It's a headline in a lot of local newspapers. Yeah.
We're on the same team, Nick. Yeah, I'm just helping you.
Join us for Ministry of Defence, Saturday nights, 8 o'clock on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Deborah McCaffrey, and join me on The Briefing Monday to Thursday at 3 p.m
You'll get your afternoon fix of all the latest political stories, debate and analysis, as well as interviews with some of the biggest names in UK politics.
It's a problem that affects the whole world, Darren.
From Westminster to Cardiff, Edinburgh and Belfast, if it's happening in UK politics, we've got it covered. That's The Briefing with me, Darren McCaffrey, Monday to Thursday, 3 p.m. on GB News.
On radio, they call it the drive time slot, 4 p.m. until 6 p.m. as listeners head home. It's that part of the schedule when the dust of the day's events begin to clarify, and we try to make sense of it for you. Brazier is drive time for radio and TV. It's fast, it's punchy, it's opinionated, there's a Brazier angle and a little bit of levity.
That's the question.
That's two questions, actually. That's Brazier, Monday to Thursday, 4 till 6 on GB News.
Well, just before the break, we were discussing the government's Rwanda plan and trying to find out whether or not a plane would take off and how many people would be on it. Well, earlier on, Boris Johnson was asked just about this by a pool journalist, and this is what he had to say.
We always said that this was going to be a long process. If you remember when I first announced the policy, I said it would take a long time to get going, and there would be plenty of legal challenges, there would be bumps on the road. But I think what opponents of the policy have to say is, well, what is your alternative? What is your alternative to people being shipped across the channel in very frail, unseaworthy dinghies, risking their lives and undermining the rule of law? What's your alternative? We think it's a sensible partnership we've set up with Rwanda. Yes, it may take a while to get working properly, but it doesn't mean we're not going to keep going.
Hundreds more have arrived today. Clearly, from the people trafficking point of view, it's worth the risk, isn't it? If only a tiny handful are going to be going in the very near future, perhaps into the medium term.
I think it's very important that we continue to show the people traffickers that their business case is going to lead, is being undermined, and that they're cheating people, and they're not only risking their lives, sending them across the sea in unseaworthy vessels, as I say, but they're also running the risk of them being sent to another country which they hadn't bargained for, and they're fundamentally ripping them off. And that's the message we need to get across to those people traffickers.
You predicted yourself that there would be all these legal challenges, and true enough, here we're seeing them. Is it not time to come out of the European Convention of Human Rights to be able to set your own rules, to stack the odds in your favour then when these legal challenges come about?
There's certainly the case that the legal fraternity, sorority, whatever, the legal world is very good at picking up ways of trying to stop the government from upholding what we think is a sensible law, and we're trying to make a distinction between legal pathways to the UK, which we support. We want people to be able to come here in fear of their lives, but we want them to do it legally and safely. And that's why we have all the safe and legal routes that are open to people. What we want to do is to show the people traffickers that they're breaking the law, they're risking people's lives, and it won't work anyway.
That was GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White challenging the Prime Minister over the government's Rwanda migrant plan. And we'll be back with Mark very shortly. It was 40 years ago today that the UK fought to protect its own territory from hostile invasion in a conflict that took 10 weeks and cost over 900 lives, 255 of them British. The Falklands conflict was the first time since the Second World War all three of Britain's armed forces were deployed simultaneously. 127 warships, submarines and merchant vessels were sent halfway around the world. But it was the yomp of British forces, 56 miles across harsh terrain, having lost vital air support in the sinking of naval vessels, that defined the conflict, with fierce fighting in the mountains finally forcing Argentina to surrender 40 years ago today. GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White looks at the legacy of the conflict and the effect it had on those who lived on the islands at the time.
It was a huge gamble, dispatching a military task force 8,000 miles into the South Atlantic winter. But for Margaret Thatcher's government, recapturing the Falklands was a political imperative. After 74 days under Argentinian control, the islands were finally liberated on the 14th of June 1982. But not before a heavy toll on both sides, with more than 250 British servicemen killed, almost 650 Argentinian losses, the deaths of 3 islanders, and a local population left deeply traumatised.
This was the kind of kit that really alarmed us because it was very heavy armour, and you can see that there's a turret there with at least a 0.5-inch machine gun, if not a cannon, and these were grinding through our streets.
Graham Bound was a young photojournalist in April 1982, running the local newspaper in Port Stanley, when he was suddenly faced with the scoop of a lifetime, an invading Argentinian army. Many of the images he captured during those months of conflict are being seen publicly for the first time, part of a fascinating exhibition at the Chatham Naval Dockyard. Images that of course document the military operation, but also the plight of a captive population caught in the middle of a violent struggle to retake the islands.
These Argentines are being rounded up by British troops. You can see, I think, Paras or Marines doing their best to round them up and at the same time getting these men to clear up a little bit. But the mess was unspeakable. This was one of our general stores here, which had been torched and was gone, but the smoke was still lingering. And when I look at these, I can almost still smell them. It was just a complete scene out of hell, frankly.
It was the day of the Vulcan bombing of Stanley Airfield that we heard HMS Hermes trying to get through to the Argentine High Command to offer terms of surrender.
Saul Pitaluga was a teenager at the time of the invasion when he and his father were captured by the Argentinians as they tried to relay a radio message from the British task force to the Argentinian command.
So long story short, they arrested my dad and took him into Stanley for some fairly rigorous questioning, and including having a gun held to his head and the mechanism being clicked to try and sort of extract more information.
By the time the Argentinians surrendered, along with the hundreds killed, the British had lost half a dozen ships and more than 30 aircraft. 4 decades on from the Falklands War, the lessons learned from that conflict have been used to help shape and improve the UK's military. Destroyers and frigates are now much better protected from air and missile strikes, and it's the reason why we now have 2 super carriers, 3 times bigger than the Falklands-era aircraft carriers, better able to protect the fleet. As the sacrifices in this pivotal military campaign are remembered, Graham Bound is anxious that the islanders, who also suffered, are not forgotten.
It's a thing quite near to my heart because I actually think that everybody just had to pick themselves up and carry on. I look at these guys, both of whom are now gone, and I'm quite proud of them, and I think they did a really good job. I wish they weren't perhaps a little bit forgotten.
Well, one of the most enduring images of the Falklands conflict was that of Simon Weston. The soldier in the Welsh Guards was on board RFA Sir Galahad when the vessel was bombed and set on fire by Argentine fighter jets. He received burns to 46% of his body and his face and was severely disfigured. Despite his injuries, Simon has spent the past 40 years raising funds for the Falklands Veterans Foundation. To commemorate the 40th anniversary, he's helping to release a single and asking for musicians to come forward to help. Our reporter Jeff Moody went to meet him.
For 40 years, he's been the face of the Falklands conflict, a face that reminds us of the darkness of war, but also the light at the end of it. But it comes at a price.
For me, I was waking up in the middle of the night, rolling round on the bedroom floor. I was on fire again, and What would wake me up was, in my nightmare, was a black jet screaming overhead with a hooded figure with flaming demonic eyes.
The nightmares have passed. Time is a healer. Today, the soldier and survivor has teamed up with soprano Carly Williams to release a single to raise funds for the Falklands Veterans Foundation.
It's hugely important, you know, and it's a beautiful song. And, you know, Carly sings it beautifully. But I totally agree that it's such a big song that it needs to have that big sound behind it.
So the hunt is on for that big sound. They're appealing to orchestras to come forward and volunteer to help re-release this single.
If we had an orchestra, it would just lift it slightly. It's very beautiful at the moment with the piano, but the real aim is for the orchestra to hopefully come in and lift it and do performances like memorials and events that take place in memory. It is currently on Spotify, the song, and on Amazon Music, and all of the proceeds go towards the charity. But we're quite keen to get it released with an orchestral sound. So if anyone would like to take part, then we'd be delighted to hear from them.
For Simon, funding has never been more important.
You know, and there are different triggers as to what happens in mental health, what kicks it off, and what makes you spiral in one way or lift in another. And there are different triggers for everybody. So, you know, whether it's euphoria or dismay, but we have to try and work harder. But there just aren't enough psychiatrists and psychologists who specialise in this area in the country, you know, so we can knock people or knock the system as much as we would like, but it's not going to change the fact there aren't enough people to do the job.
As the 40th anniversary brings the conflict into sharper focus, calls are growing now for Simon to receive a knighthood. It's news to him.
If it does happen, it does happen. But I'm not going to live my life in hope for something to happen. There's unbelievably large amounts of people in this country who deserve to be recognised for many, many things. And there are people that go unrecognised all their lives and they make such a massive difference in so many people's lives. So I think I'll leave that to the powers that be. It's nothing to do with me. I'm not involved in it. I don't know anything about anybody particularly starting anything or wanting to do anything. But if it does come around, it comes around. But, you know, I don't live in hope of that one.
Simon might not, but there are plenty who do. Jeff Moody, GB News.
What an icon he is. Well, Liz Truss has today pledged to do everything possible to save the 2 British soldiers conscripted to Ukraine's army from execution. But as they languish behind bars and the Foreign Secretary talks tough, Putin is busy planning his next move. The solemnity and sincerity of the conveyor belt of world leaders pledging unfailing support to Ukraine has not been borne out in reality. As up to 200 Ukrainian soldiers are now dying per day, and British fighters get swept up in the brutal conflict, the constant call for the arms Zelensky's men needs has been met with not even a quarter of what has been begged for. Meanwhile, all those tough talks on sanctions betrays a grim truth. Today, with inflated fuel prices, the Kremlin is earning even more from Europe than it did before the invasion, with 2/3 of Putin's profits coming from the EU alone. France, Belgium and the Netherlands are snapping up discounted fuel while their leaders put on hollow diplomatic displays. Make no mistake, in a land where public parks and city squares play host to hours of chess, Machiavellian strategy is a Russian forte, with Putin pricing in every opportunity for leverage with the entire world, inflating energy costs, global food shortages, and foreign fighters used as pawns in the game. I'm joined now by Mesa Gifford, who fought against ISIS in Syria and is a friend of Aidan Aslin, one of the captured Brits facing capital punishment. It's fantastic to have you on the show, Mesa. First of all, let's talk about Aidan and how do you think he'll be bearing up with this hanging over him as someone who knows him?
He would be shocked by the sentence. He expected to be treated as a prisoner of war. He was due all the protection and respect as a POW. And Russia, by doing this, is acting like not only a rogue state, but like a terror state. Aidan fought bravely in Mariupol. He only surrendered when his ammunition ran out and the water and food ran out. And he expected to be treated with some level of dignity. And this has come as a shock to everyone in the UK and no doubt to Aidan as well.
You yourself have fought abroad. I mean, it's important to point out that Aidan was, of course, conscripted to the Ukraine army. But what is it that compels someone to do that, to want to be involved in a foreign conflict?
Well, Aidan actually wasn't conscripted. So he left the UK in 2018. I was with him, I think, the day before he left. And here was a young man that fought bravely in Syria against the so-called Islamic State. He fought, I think, for 2 years there. That's where I met him. And he told me in 2018, with the crisis in the Donbass ongoing, he felt incredibly sorry for the Ukrainian people. And he went out there not only to join the Ukrainian military, but also to build a new life. I mean, he met his fiancée out there. I think he's been given Ukrainian citizenship, or at least dual nationality. I'm not sure. But he's a Brit by birth. And he's a true internationalist. He's someone who's passionately motivated to protect a sovereign country that's been horribly invaded and utterly destroyed by a tyrannical power that's got no business being there.
Main themes when people are talking about war in Ukraine is how far Russia are likely to go. Now, you, of course, having fought in Syria with Kurdish forces, I believe, against ISIS, must have seen firsthand some of the Russian involvement there on the side of Assad's forces. Does it worry you as to the sort of devastation that Russia could wreak somewhere like Ukraine if they aren't making progress?
Well, they've already started. I mean, Mariupol has been utterly annihilated. That's straight from the Russian playbook in Syria. They destroyed Aleppo and bombed it into submission. And that's very much what Russia has perfected in Syria. I mean, they will often surround a community, not allow any food or water to get in, and then they will just start bombing. Almost barrel bombing them into submission, trying to erode any level of sort of will to carry on fighting by the local population. And I think we've seen that most obviously in Ukraine, in places like Bucha, where the civilian population were horribly treated and murdered on the streets. And I've actually just come back from Ukraine. I've just spent the last month and a half as part of a medical team training something like, I think we trained about 1,500 Ukrainian service people in TCCC, handing out a vast amount of medical kits. And behind the line, I've seen with my own eyes the terrible destruction in places like Kyiv. I've spoken to ordinary people who've seen their homes destroyed, their families ripped apart, all the young men flooding to join, and the women too, flooding to join the army. And what we have is really Britain in sort of 1939, 1940, alone against Nazi Germany, bravely battling back. It's an underdog story. And I would hope that Britain and its allies in Europe would be doing so much more for them. That's the real crisis that's going on at the moment, is how much more support do we give them?
Yeah, indeed, much more support needed. Without that, Mesa Gifford, you're a fascinating man with fascinating insights and stories. I'd love to sit down and have a much longer conversation with you in the future. That's about it for now. Join me again if we need to talk about on GB News at the same time, 2 o'clock tomorrow. It's been wonderful having you here, Joanne, and we're going to have you back again. You're always valued on this programme. Coming up next, of course, it's the briefing. First, though, it's time for the weather forecast. Let's keep our fingers crossed. It looks changeable, but good for the future, I think. Let's find out.
Hello, I'm Alex Deacon with your latest weather update. Warm and sunny today, and we're going to go to hot and sunny by the end of the week. It's not dry and sunny everywhere, however. We've still got a few showers in the far northwest over the Highlands of Scotland, the Western Isles and at times the Northern Isles. Maybe the odd shower for Northern Ireland this evening as well. But for most places, it's dry through this evening. It's going to be a dry and a clear night as well. Temperatures in rural spots could drop down into single figures, but most towns and cities staying in double digits. A fairly warm start to what will be a very warm day. We'll be bathed in sunshine by and large. Still some patchy rain across northeast Scotland initially, and the Northern Isles always susceptible to some showers. There'll be rain at times over the Northern Highlands and the Western Isles. But for the vast majority, it's dry, and for many of us, it'll be lengthy spells of sunshine. Some cloud will bubble up through the day. Temperatures will jump up through the day, widely into the low to mid-20s. 28 is possible in the London area, warming up across the eastern and southern parts of Scotland as well. Still to the northwest, some patchy rain, and that may just drift a little further south as we head through Wednesday evening. But by and large, it'll be another dry and clear night, leading into another sunny and very warm day on Thursday. Again, some cloud around here and there, and particularly across western parts of Northern Ireland, northwest Scotland, the likelihood of some rain. It may even threaten to push more widely into Northern Ireland, southwest Scotland, some of that rain by the end of Thursday. But for most, it's again another day of sunny skies and high temperatures. 28, 29 in the London area, could even be a degree or so higher, and certainly we're expecting it to get higher on Friday. High pressure is in control, but as it edges away, a plume of hot air spreads up from the continent, and temperatures on Friday likely to peak at 33, maybe 34 Celsius. Cooler air will be arriving by Saturday from the north and potentially bringing some heavy showers.